The thermometer read 32 degrees outside Henrik Dalström's cabin that January morning in 1841. But when he knelt and pressed his palm against the wooden floor planks near his wife's body, the wood felt like touching a block of ice pulled straight from a frozen lake. Marta had collapsed during the night just 3 feet from the fireplace, where coals still glowed orange, and the floor beneath her had stolen every degree of warmth from her body while Henrik slept 10 feet away on their elevated bunk. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story reveals how one frontier woman's bread-baking mistake created a heating system that kept cabins warm for 3 full days without adding a single log to the fire. Henrik Dalström woke to silence, which was wrong because Marta always woke before him, always had the fire built up and coffee heating by the time dawn light reached through their single cabin window. He opened his eyes and saw gray winter light filtering through frost patterns on the glass. The cabin was cold, colder than it should have been. He sat up and looked toward the fireplace. Coals still glowed in the ash, not dead, just reduced to embers that would need feeding. Marta should have been there, crouched by the hearth, adding kindling. He called her name. No answer came. He swung his legs over the edge of the sleeping platform and dropped down to the cabin floor. The shock of cold through his wool socks made him gasp. The floor planks felt like standing on river ice, so cold it burned through the fabric. He saw her then, lying near the base of the fireplace, curled on her side, one arm extended toward the stones as if she had been reaching for warmth. Henrik crossed the 6 steps between them. He knelt beside her and touched her shoulder. Her dress was stiff with cold. He said her name again, quietly this time, because he already knew. Her skin was cold, colder than the air, colder than anything living should ever be. He gathered her into his arms and carried her to the sleeping platform. He wrapped her in the blankets, knowing it was pointless, knowing warmth could not return to her. He sat beside her and tried to understand what had happened. She had been healthy, 31 years old, strong from 3 years of frontier life. He looked at the fireplace. Coal still glowed. The fire had not gone completely out. He looked at the floor where she had lain and walked back to that spot, kneeling and pressing both palms flat against the planks. The wood was so cold it hurt to touch. He held his hands there, feeling the cold transfer into his skin, and he understood. The floor had killed her. Marta had gotten up in the night, probably to feed the fire, and she had collapsed. When she fell to the floor, when her body made contact with those frozen planks, the wood had conducted heat away from her core so efficiently that she could not recover. She had lain there 3 feet from glowing coals and frozen to death on the floor of her own home. Henrik remained kneeling on that spot, his hands pressed against the planks, feeling exactly what had killed his wife. Cold rising from the frozen earth below, passing through wood as if the floor were barely there at all, turning the surface they walked on every day into something lethal. Henrik buried Marta 3 days later on a hillside overlooking the creek. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. He spent 2 full days breaking through it with a pickaxe, his breath clouding in the February air, his hands blistering through his gloves. Other settlers from nearby claims came to help dig and to stand witness. Tobias Kern spoke some words from Scripture. Lars Bergquist offered condolences in Swedish. Then they left Henrik alone with stones he arranged over the grave. He returned to the cabin as afternoon light faded. Cold air hung heavy near the floor. Warmer air layered near the ceiling where heat from the fireplace accumulated uselessly. He built up the fire and sat on the sleeping platform, his feet dangling above the floor, not touching it. He had not walked barefoot on those planks since the morning he found Marta. That evening, Henrik began examining heat behavior inside the cabin. He was not an educated man. He had 3 years of schooling in Sweden before his family emigrated when he was 9. But he understood cause and effect. He took the iron poker from beside the fireplace and laid it on the floor planks near the hearth. He counted to 60, then picked it up. The metal was cold. He laid the same poker on the wooden table. counted to 60, picked it up. The metal retained some warmth. The floor planks drew heat downward toward frozen earth beneath. The table had air below it, air that warmed from the fire, so the table surface stayed warmer. The floor was not simply a surface they walked on. It was a bridge conducting heat directly into the ground, and in winter, that ground was a vast, frozen mass that absorbed warmth endlessly. Henrik walked slowly around the cabin's interior, feeling temperature differences with each step. Near the fireplace, the floor was cold but tolerable. 6 feet away, it grew colder. At the far wall opposite the hearth, the planks felt like frozen stone. Heat radiated from the fire in all directions, but the floor swallowed it before it could warm the living space. He spent the next week observing. He noticed that elevating objects helped. The sleeping platform stayed warmer because air circulated beneath it. Supply crates stacked on the table stayed dry, while identical crates on the floor grew damp from condensation. Height mattered. Distance from that frozen surface mattered. But he could not live on elevated platforms. The floor itself was the problem, and traditional construction offered no solution. Every cabin used the same method. Lay logs directly on the ground as foundation. Place floor planks across those logs. Thickness alone did not stop cold from rising through wood. Henrik began asking himself a question that would consume the next 6 months. What if the floor did not touch the ground at all? The idea seemed absurd at first. Floors had to rest on something. But Henrik could not stop thinking about the sleeping platform, about how it stayed warmer because air existed between it and the floor below. Air was a poor conductor of heat compared to solid wood. He knew this from experience, even if he did not know the scientific terms. A wool blanket kept you warm, not because wool generated heat, but because it trapped air in its fibers. Still, air did not move heat efficiently. What if he built a floor that trapped air beneath it? Not just a gap, but a deliberate space designed to keep the living surface separated from frozen ground? He began sketching ideas with charcoal on a flat stone. His drawings were crude, but the concept clarified as he worked. A raised platform spanning the entire cabin floor, tall enough that significant air could exist beneath it. Then a second floor built on top of that platform. But air moved. Warm air rose. Cold air sank. If he simply created empty space between 2 floors, air would circulate, creating convection currents that would transfer cold upward almost as efficiently as solid wood. He needed something that would trap the air, prevent it from moving, keep it still. The answer came during a trip to fetch supplies from a lumber operation 30 miles south. The mill used a water-powered saw to cut logs into dimensional lumber. Henrik arrived in late February to purchase wood, and he saw the sawdust, mountains of it, golden piles of wood particles and shavings accumulating wherever the saw worked. The mill operator, a man named Gresham, simply pushed the sawdust aside to keep his work area clear. Most sat in enormous piles, serving no purpose. Henrik stood looking at those piles and understood immediately. Sawdust was tiny pieces of wood with air trapped between every particle. If you packed it densely enough, the air could not circulate, could not create convection currents. The wood particles themselves were poor conductors. Together, they would create a matrix of trapped air that heat could not pass through efficiently. He approached Gresham and asked if he could haul away sawdust. The mill operator laughed and said Henrik could take every particle on the property. Most men considered sawdust a nuisance. Henrik spent that day shoveling sawdust into burlap sacks and loading them into his wagon. He filled 23 sacks, as much weight as his 2 horses could pull, for the 30-mile return journey. During that ride home, Henrik refined his plan. He would build a raised platform 6 inches above the cabin's current floor. He would build a second floor on top of that platform. In the 6-inch gap between floors, he would pack sawdust as densely as possible, creating a barrier that trapped air without allowing it to move. The living surface would be separated from frozen ground by 12 inches of wood and trapped air. Heat from the fire would warm the top floor, and that warmth would have no efficient path downward toward the cold earth waiting below. The physics were sound, even if he did not know he was doing physics. He was simply observing cause and effect and designing a solution based on those observations. Henrik returned to his cabin with 23 sacks of sawdust stacked in his wagon, and before he even unloaded them, he knew he would need far more. He had measured the cabin's interior dimensions in his mind during the ride home: 16 feet by 20 feet, 320 square feet of floor space. If he wanted a 6-inch layer of sawdust packed densely enough to prevent air circulation, he would need approximately 160 cubic feet of material. The sacks he had brought contained perhaps 20 cubic feet. Total, he needed 8 times more. Over the next 3 weeks, Henrik made 5 additional trips to Gresham's lumber mill. Each journey took 2 full days, one day traveling south with empty wagon, one day returning with a load of sawdust that grew heavier with each trip as he learned to pack the sacks more efficiently. Gresham stopped laughing by the 3rd visit and started asking questions. What did Henrik plan to do with so much sawdust? Was he planning to burn it, mix it with clay for chinking? Henrik explained his double-floor concept in simple terms. Gresham listened, nodded politely, and clearly thought Henrik had lost his mind to grief. But he continued allowing Henrik to haul away as much sawdust as he wanted. By mid-March, Henrik had accumulated enough material. 147 sacks of sawdust sat stacked against the exterior wall of his cabin, covered with canvas to keep them dry. Neighbors who passed by on their way to check trap lines or hunt saw the growing pile and asked questions. Henrik explained what he intended to build. The reactions were consistent: polite confusion, followed by barely concealed amusement. Tobias Kern was the most vocal skeptic. He stopped by one afternoon in late March and examined the sacks of sawdust with obvious bewilderment. He asked Henrik why anyone would fill a floor with garbage. Sawdust was waste material. It composted and rotted. It attracted insects. It served no structural purpose. Building a second floor above the first was wasteful enough, but filling the gap with sawdust seemed to Tobias like the action of a man whose grief had affected his judgment. Henrik did not argue. He simply explained the principle of trapped air and insulation. Tobias shook his head and said that if Henrik wanted a warmer floor, he should build his cabin with a root cellar beneath it, like some settlers did. The earth below the frost line stayed at a constant temperature year-round. That was proven knowledge. Trapping sawdust between 2 floors was unproven foolishness that would waste months of work and considerable lumber. William Thatcher stopped by a week later and offered similar opinions. He pointed out that Henrik's cabin would lose 6 inches of interior height. The doorway would need modification. The fireplace hearth would no longer be level with the floor. Every piece of furniture would need adjustment. And for what benefit? An unproven theory about trapped air that might accomplish nothing except creating a fire hazard if sparks from the fireplace ignited the sawdust below. Henrik listened to all the objections. He acknowledged the risks and the work involved. Then he continued preparing for construction because the alternative was living in a cabin that had killed his wife, and that was unacceptable. Henrik announced his construction plans on a Sunday in early April when several neighboring families gathered at Lars Bergquist's claim for a communal meal. These gatherings happened monthly when, weather permitted, giving isolated settlers a chance to share news, trade supplies, and maintain some sense of community in the scattered wilderness. Henrik had avoided the previous gathering in March, too raw from Marta's death to face social interaction. But April brought warmer weather and the need to explain what he was about to do to his cabin. He waited until after the meal when the men gathered outside to smoke pipes and discuss spring planting and trapping prospects. There were 8 men present, including Henrik: Tobias Kern, William Thatcher, Amos Rutledge, Lars Bergquist, and 3 others from claims farther west. Henrik explained his double floor plan simply and directly. He would build a raised platform inside his existing cabin, Fill the gap with sawdust for insulation, then construct a new floor surface on top. The goal was preventing ground cold from rising through the floor during winter. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Tobias Kern laughed. It was not a polite chuckle, but a full, genuine laugh that doubled him over slightly. He asked if Henrik was serious. Henrik confirmed that he was completely serious. Tobias laughed again and said this was the most ridiculous construction idea he had ever heard. Building 2 floors where one was sufficient, wasting good lumber on a platform nobody would see, filling the gap with garbage. It was madness. William Thatcher joined in, though his mockery was less harsh. He pointed out that settlers had been building cabins with single floors for generations. If the method was adequate for everyone else, why did Henrik think he needed something different? Floors were cold in winter. That was simply reality. You wore boots indoors. You kept the fire burning. You accepted discomfort as the price of frontier life. Amos Rutledge offered a different criticism. He suggested Henrik was wasting time and resources on cabin modifications when he should be preparing fields for planting or establishing. New trap lines. Spring was the season for productive work, not experimental construction projects. A widower needed to focus on practical survival, not elaborate building theories. Lars Bergquist, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke. He asked Henrik why he believed sawdust would prevent cold from rising. Henrik explained about trapped air, about how wool blankets worked, about how the sleeping platform stayed warmer than the floor. Lars listened and nodded slowly. He did not mock the idea, but he also did not endorse it. He simply said it was Henrik's cabin and Henrik's decision. The gathering dispersed shortly after. As Henrik prepared to leave, he overheard Tobias telling William that grief had affected Henrik's judgment. Building with sawdust. What would he try next? Heating his cabin with ice? The comment was meant to be heard. Henrik climbed into his wagon and drove home, knowing that every neighbor within 20 miles would soon hear about his foolish plan. Henrik began construction the following Monday. The first task was removing all furniture and supplies from the cabin interior, creating an empty workspace. He moved everything outside and covered it with canvas against possible rain. The sleeping platform, table, chairs, supply crates, tools, everything that had furnished his home for 3 years now sat in a pile beside the cabin. The interior looked vast and empty without those familiar objects. He started by measuring and marking the exact perimeter where his raised platform would sit. He wanted the platform to span the entire floor, stopping just 6 inches from each wall. This gap would allow air circulation around the edges and make future repairs accessible if needed. Using a piece of charcoal, he marked lines on the existing floor planks, creating a rectangle that measured 15 feet by 19 feet. The platform framework required substantial lumber. Henrik had purchased additional milled timber during his sawdust. Retrieval trips, spending money he had saved from 2 years of successful trapping. The expense was significant, but he had no wife to support now, no future to save for in the way he had planned. The money would either solve his floor problem or be wasted on a failed experiment. He built the platform frame using 4 by 4 inch posts as vertical supports. These posts would bear the weight of everything above, so he spaced them carefully, placing 1 post every 3 feet in a grid pattern. 20 posts total, each one exactly 6 inches tall. He cut each post to identical length, using a measuring stick he had marked precisely. Consistency mattered. If the posts varied in height, the platform would not be level, and everything built on top would be compromised. Setting the posts was meticulous work. The existing floor was not perfectly level. It had settled slightly over 3 years, creating minor variations. Henrik used wooden shims, thin wedges he carved from scrap wood, to adjust each post until its top surface was perfectly level with all the others. He checked constantly using a water level, a simple tool made from a length of hollow reed filled with water. Water always found true level. If the water stood at the same height on both ends of the reed, the 2 points were level with each other. This process took 6 full days. Tobias Kern rode past twice during that week and stopped to watch through the open cabin door. He said nothing, just observed Henrik kneeling on the floor, adjusting posts and checking levels with obsessive precision. On the second visit, Tobias shook his head and rode away without speaking. By the end of the first week, Henrik had 20 posts standing at exactly 6 inches high, each one shimmed and leveled, ready to support the platform framework that would come next. The platform framework went up quickly once the support posts were established. Henrik laid beams across the posts, creating a grid structure that would support the floor above. He used 6-inch by 2-inch planks for these beams, overlapping them at corners and securing each joint with hand-forged nails he had purchased from a blacksmith in the nearest settlement. The nails were expensive, but screws did not exist in forms suitable for this type of construction, and wooden pegs would not provide adequate strength for a floor that needed to support his full weight, plus furniture. The beam framework created a series of rectangular cells, each approximately 3 feet by 3 feet. These cells would hold the sawdust, but Henrik recognized a problem immediately. If he simply poured sawdust into the entire 6-inch cavity without divisions, the material would settle unevenly over time. Areas where he walked frequently would compress the sawdust beneath, creating thin spots that would reduce insulation effectiveness. He needed to compartmentalize the space, creating smaller sections that would maintain consistent density even under varying pressure from above. He spent 2 days building internal dividers. Using thin boards, he created a grid within the platform framework, dividing each large cell into 4 smaller squares. The result was a platform filled with small compartments, each one approximately 18 inches square. When filled with sawdust and topped with floor planks, these compartments would act independently. If sawdust in one section compressed slightly, adjacent sections would maintain their full depth. The compartment system created another benefit Henrik had not initially considered. If moisture somehow entered the sawdust layer, the compartments would contain the damage to a small area, rather than allowing rot to spread across the entire floor. This redundancy was not part of his original design, but it emerged naturally from solving the settling problem. With the framework and compartments complete, Henrik began the tedious process of filling each section with sawdust. He opened his sacks and poured the golden material carefully, filling each compartment to exactly 6 inches depth. He used a flat board to level the sawdust, pressing down firmly to pack it tight. The material compressed slightly under pressure, so he packed again, added more, until each compartment was filled with dense, compressed sawdust that would not settle further. This filling process took 12 days. Each compartment required approximately 2 cubic feet of sawdust. With over 100 compartments to fill, Henrik spent long hours kneeling on the platform framework, pouring and packing and leveling. His hands developed new calluses, his back ached from the repetitive bending. But the work was methodical and satisfying. He could see progress. Each filled compartment was a small victory, a tangible step toward solving the problem that had killed Marta. Neighbors continued to stop by and watch. William Thatcher visited one afternoon and stood in the doorway for several minutes, observing Henrik pour sawdust into the compartments. He asked what would happen when the sawdust rotted. Henrik explained that sawdust from pine and fir resisted decay naturally due to their resin content, and the dry environment between floors would prevent moisture accumulation. William shrugged and said time would tell. His tone suggested he expected failure. By late May, Henrik had filled every compartment with packed sawdust. The platform framework now held over 160 cubic feet of insulation material, creating a dense barrier between the original cabin floor and the empty space above where the new walking surface would be installed. The cabin interior looked strange, industrial, like a workshop floor rather than a living space. The sawdust gave off a pleasant scent, fresh wood smell that reminded Henrik of Gresham's lumber mill. Now came the critical phase, installing the top floor planks. This surface would be the actual floor he lived on, the wood his feet would touch every day, the barrier between his body heat and the insulated cavity below. The planks needed to be thick enough to support weight without flexing, smooth enough for comfortable walking, and fitted tightly enough to prevent sawdust from escaping through gaps. Henrik had purchased premium milled lumber for this purpose, spending nearly half his remaining savings. The planks were pine, 2 inches thick, 10 inches wide, and cut to precise 16-foot lengths. Each plank weighed approximately 40 pounds. He had ordered 30 planks, enough to cover the platform with slight overlap for trimming. The lumber had arrived 3 weeks earlier, and Henrik had stacked it inside the cabin to acclimate to the interior humidity. Wood that was installed immediately after delivery often warped as it adjusted to new moisture conditions. Letting it rest indoors first minimized that risk. He began installation at the wall farthest from the door, working his way toward the entrance. The first plank went down, smoothly, resting on the platform beams with satisfying solidity. Henrik secured it with nails driven through the plank into the beams below, spacing nails every 18 inches. The second plank fit tightly against the first. He had to use a mallet and a scrap block of wood to tap it into position, but once seated, the joint between planks was barely visible. By the third plank, doubt began creeping into Henrik's mind. He was 10 weeks into this project. He had spent significant money on lumber, nails, and sawdust transportation. He had invested hundreds of hours in design, construction, and installation. His cabin had been uninhabitable during the entire process, forcing him to sleep outside under canvas or occasionally accept offers to stay in neighbors' cabins. And he still had no proof the system would work. The sawdust might compress further under sustained weight. The floor might develop squeaks or weakness at the joints. The insulation might prove inadequate despite all his calculations and reasoning. He might finish this entire construction only to discover that winter cold still penetrated upward, that he had wasted months building an elaborate failure. Henrik stopped working and sat on the partially completed floor. The planks beneath him felt solid. The sawdust layer did not compress noticeably under his weight. Everything seemed structurally sound. But structural soundness was not the goal. Thermal performance was the goal, and that could only be tested when winter returned, 6 months away. Henrik completed the floor installation over the next 8 days. Each plank required careful fitting, and the final rows near the door needed custom cutting to fit around the door frame and fireplace hearth. He used a handsaw to make these cuts, working slowly to ensure accuracy. A gap of more than a quarter inch would allow sawdust to leak through, and covering such gaps with trim would look sloppy. He took pride in tight joinery, even though nobody except him would see the finished work. The doorway presented a specific challenge. The new floor was 6 inches higher than the original, which meant the door threshold was now 6 inches below the interior floor level. Anyone entering would have to step up significantly. Henrik solved this by building a wooden step just inside the door, a raised platform that made the transition manageable. The step was solid, braced underneath, capable of supporting weight without shifting. The fireplace created a different problem. The hearth, a flat stone surface extending 2 feet from the fireplace opening, was now 6 inches below the new floor level. Henrik could not raise the hearth without rebuilding the entire fireplace, work that would take weeks and risk structural damage. Instead, he built a wooden frame around the hearth, creating a box that brought the floor level up to match while leaving the stone surface accessible. This frame required careful construction to ensure no gaps existed where sparks could fall through and ignite the sawdust below. Fire safety had concerned Henrik throughout the building process. Sawdust was flammable. A large quantity of it, trapped beneath his floor, represented a potential hazard if sparks or embers penetrated the top floor layer. He addressed this by ensuring the floor planks fit tightly, by building the fireplace frame with overlapping joints that blocked any gaps, and by keeping a bucket of sand near the hearth that could smother small fires immediately if needed. With the floor complete, Henrik began reinstalling furniture. The sleeping platform, originally built to stand on the old floor, now needed modification. He cut 6 inches from each leg, bringing it to the correct height relative to the new floor surface. The table received similar treatment. Chairs needed no modification since their heights worked proportionally. Supply crates simply sat on the new floor without adjustment. The cabin interior looked normal again, or nearly normal. The ceiling felt slightly lower, compressed by the 6-inch floor elevation. The door threshold required that awkward step up, but otherwise the space functioned as it had before, with one crucial difference. The floor felt different underfoot, not warmer yet, since summer weather made temperature comparisons meaningless, but more solid somehow, more substantial. Walking across the planks produced no creaks, no flexing, just firm support that suggested quality construction beneath. Henrik completed the final details in early June. He installed baseboards around the cabin perimeter, covering the 6-inch gap between the new floor and the walls. These trim pieces were purely aesthetic, but they gave the interior a finished appearance that made the modification seem intentional rather than experimental. He filled small gaps between floor planks with a mixture of pine resin and sawdust, creating a paste that hardened into a flexible seal. This prevented any sawdust from escaping. Through joints and eliminated drafts that might reduce insulation effectiveness. The entire project had consumed 11 weeks, from the day he began removing furniture to this moment of completion. 11 weeks of constant physical labor, problem-solving, and meticulous attention to detail. Henrik stood in the center of his cabin and examined the results. The floor looked professional, level, and solid. Nothing about the finished surface revealed the complex insulation system hidden beneath. To a casual observer, it appeared to be a standard plank floor, built with exceptional care. He invited Lars Bergquist to inspect the completed work. Lars arrived on a warm afternoon and walked slowly around the cabin interior, testing the floor with his weight, examining the joints, studying the fireplace frame and door threshold modifications. He knelt and knocked on the floor planks, listening to the solid thunk rather than hollow echo. He asked Henrik to explain the construction again, and Henrik walked him through each layer, from the support posts to the compartmented sawdust to the top floor surface. Lars was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The craftsmanship was excellent. The floor was clearly well built, but whether it would perform as Henrik hoped, that remained to be proven. Winter was the only true test, and winter was 6 months away." Lars asked what Henrik would do if the system failed, if winter came and the floor remained as cold as before, despite all this effort. Henrik had no answer for that question. He had invested everything he had, financially and emotionally, into this solution. If it failed, he would have proven only that grief could drive a man to waste months building an elaborate monument to false hope. But he did not believe it would fail. The physics were sound. Trapped air was proven insulation. The construction was solid. The system would work because it had to work. Lars left without offering encouragement or criticism, just a neutral acknowledgement that time would reveal the truth. Over the following week, other neighbors stopped by to see the finished floor. Tobias Kern walked through, shook his head, and said Henrik had built the most expensive floor in Montana Territory. William Thatcher tapped the planks with his boot and commented that it seemed solid enough, though he still questioned the purpose. Amos Rutledge examined the door threshold step and suggested Henrik would tire of climbing up and down every time he entered or exited. The common thread in all these reactions was polite skepticism. Nobody was openly hostile. Nobody told Henrik he had wasted his time, but nobody believed the system would deliver the dramatic improvement Henrik claimed to expect. They saw an elaborate floor that looked slightly unusual. They did not see innovation. They saw a widower's grief project, well executed, but ultimately pointless. Henrik accepted their skepticism without argument. Words would not convince them. Only winter would prove whether his 11 weeks of work had solved the problem or simply created an expensive failure that would become a cautionary tale told around frontier campfires for years to come. Summer passed slowly. Henrik returned to trapping and hunting, restocking supplies he had depleted during the construction months. The cabin felt different now, though he could not articulate exactly how. The floor was quieter underfoot, more solid, more permanent. But temperature differences were impossible to detect during summer months when both interior and exterior temperatures stayed comfortable without heating. September brought cooler nights. Henrik began using the fireplace in the evenings, burning small fires that took the chill off the air without creating the intense heat necessary for true winter survival. These mild fires provided his first opportunity to observe how the new floor system responded to thermal stress. He noticed immediately that the floor surface warmed more quickly than he remembered from previous autumns. After burning a fire for 2 hours, he could walk barefoot on the planks comfortably. In past years, the floor remained cold even when the cabin air was warm, the wood conducting heat downward into the earth as fast as the fire could generate it. Now the floor seemed to retain warmth. He knelt and pressed his palm flat against the planks. They were not hot, but they were no longer cold. They held temperature somewhere between neutral and warm. This observation encouraged him, but it was not proof. Autumn temperatures were mild. The ground beneath the cabin had not yet frozen. The real test would come when January brought sustained cold that froze the earth solid and turned the Montana landscape into a frozen expanse where exposed skin could freeze in minutes. October brought the first hard frost. Henrik woke one morning to find ice crystals coating the inside of his window. The fire had died during the night, and the cabin interior was cold. He climbed down from the sleeping platform expecting the familiar shock of icy floor planks against his feet. Instead, the floor felt cool, but not painfully cold. He stood still, letting his bare feet adjust, and realized he could tolerate the contact without needing to immediately put on boots. He rebuilt the fire and spent the next hour observing the floor's response. As the cabin warmed, the floor surface warmed proportionally. There was no sensation of cold radiating upward from below, no sense that the earth was drawing heat away faster than the fire could replace it. The floor behaved like furniture, warming and cooling with the air temperature rather than acting as a thermal drain. By late October, nighttime temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. Henrik maintained a fire burning continuously, feeding it every few hours to prevent coals from dying completely. The cabin stayed comfortable, and more importantly, the floor stayed tolerable. He could walk barefoot briefly without discomfort. This was unprecedented in his experience. In previous winters, bare feet on the floor was intolerable. Even with a roaring fire heating the cabin air, he began taking measurements, not with instruments he did not own, but with systematic observations he recorded in a journal. Each morning before building up the fire, he noted the floor temperature relative to his hand. Each evening after burning fires all day, he made the same comparison. The floor in November was consistently warmer than he remembered from previous Novembers, though without a thermometer, he could not quantify the difference precisely. The first significant snow fell in mid-November, 8 inches of heavy wet snow that blanketed the Montana landscape and signaled winter's true arrival. Temperatures dropped sharply. Within 3 days, the ground froze solid. Henrik could hear the earth contracting at night, sharp cracks echoing across the landscape as frozen soil compressed. This was the condition that had killed Marta, frozen ground, conducting cold upward through inadequate floors into living spaces where humans tried to survive. Henrik maintained his fire carefully, burning seasoned wood he had split and stacked during summer months. The cabin stayed warm, upper air temperatures comfortable enough that he wore only a single wool shirt indoors. But the critical measurement was floor temperature, and that exceeded his expectations dramatically. On November 19th, 3 days after the ground froze completely, Henrik conducted a deliberate test. He let the fire die down to minimal coals in the early morning, allowing the cabin to cool significantly. Then he walked barefoot across the entire floor, testing every section. Near the fireplace, the floor was neutral temperature, neither warm nor cold. At the center of the cabin, 15 feet from the hearth, The floor was cool but not painful. At the far wall, 20 feet from any heat source, the floor was cold but still, tolerable for brief contact. He had never experienced anything like this. In previous winters with the old floor, the far wall area was intolerable barefoot, even with fires burning continuously. The old floor conducted ground cold so efficiently that distance from the fireplace meant standing on what felt like ice. Now, with 8 inches of frozen earth beneath the cabin, the floor remained tolerably cool even in the coldest areas. Henrik rebuilt the fire and spent the day observing temperature changes. As the fire heated the cabin air, the floor warmed proportionally and held that warmth. When he stepped outside briefly to fetch more firewood, then returned to the heated cabin, the floor felt noticeably warm against his cold feet. The planks were storing heat and radiating it back into the living space instead of conducting it downward into frozen ground. December brought sustained cold. Daytime temperatures struggled to reach 20 degrees. Nighttime temperatures dropped below zero regularly. This was brutal Montana winter, the kind of cold that killed unprepared travelers and tested every aspect of frontier construction. Henrik's cabin, with its experimental floor system, faced its first true crisis. He burned fires continuously, maintaining heat 24 hours each day. Wood consumption was significant but manageable. The cabin stayed comfortable, and remarkably, the floor stayed warm. Not hot, but genuinely warm to the touch. He could walk barefoot anywhere in the cabin without discomfort. He could sit on the floor to work on equipment repairs. He could place items directly on the floor without them becoming cold. The difference was so dramatic that Henrik questioned his own memory. Had the old floor really been as terrible as he remembered, or was grief amplifying his recollection of that winter morning when Marta died? He walked outside and placed his hand on the frozen ground. The earth was so cold it burned his skin within seconds. That cold existed, just inches below his cabin floor, separated only by wooden planks, sawdust, and trapped air. The system was working exactly as he had theorized. January 1842 brought weather that old-timers would reference for decades. A massive storm system settled over Montana territory in the second week of the month, bringing temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there for 6 consecutive days. Wind drove the cold through every gap in construction, through chimneys, around door frames, through any weakness in a building's defenses. This was survival weather, conditions that tested whether your shelter was adequate or a death trap. Henrik prepared by stacking extra firewood inside the cabin, enough to last 3 days without going outside. He checked the door seal, stuffing cloth around the frame where cold air infiltrated. He closed the chimney damper partially to prevent excessive heat loss while maintaining enough draft for the fire to burn cleanly. Then he settled in to endure the storm. The first night, temperatures dropped to 25 below zero. Wind howled across the landscape, driving snow horizontally and piling drifts against anything that interrupted the wind's path. Henrik's cabin, built in a slightly sheltered location, still took the storm's full force. Wind found gaps around the door and window, creating cold drafts that swirled through the interior despite his preparation efforts. He maintained a large fire, burning more wood than usual to compensate for heat loss through infiltration. The cabin air stayed warm near the ceiling, cooler at waist height, and he expected the floor to be painfully cold despite the insulation system. But when he climbed down from the sleeping platform in the middle of the night to add wood to the fire, his bare feet met floor planks that were merely cool, not frozen. By the third day of sustained extreme cold, Henrik had burned through half his interior wood supply. He needed to go outside to bring in more from the woodpile, but the wind and temperature made that dangerous. He bundled in every layer of clothing he owned, covered his face with a wool scarf, and stepped outside for the 30 seconds required to grab an armload of split wood and return. The cold was stunning, painful even through heavy clothing. His exposed eyes watered immediately, tears freezing on his eyelashes before he reached the door. Back inside, shivering from even that brief exposure, he appreciated his cabin's performance in new ways. The walls held steady. The roof showed no signs of ice damming or heat loss. And the floor, even with wind driving cold air under the door, remained tolerably cool rather than painfully frozen. The sawdust insulation was preventing ground cold from penetrating upward despite the most extreme conditions Montana could deliver. On the fourth day, Lars Bergquist arrived mid-morning, having traveled from his cabin 2 miles away. He looked exhausted, his face wind-burned, his clothes crusted with frozen condensation from his breath. He explained that his cabin had become nearly uninhabitable. The floor was sheets of ice. His family was huddling on elevated bunks, burning through wood at unsustainable rates just to keep from freezing. He had come to see if Henrik's experimental floor was performing any better. Henrik invited him inside. Lars entered and immediately noticed the temperature difference. Henrik's cabin was genuinely warm, not just barely survivable, but actually comfortable. Lars knelt and placed his hand on the floor. He looked up at Henrik with an expression that mixed surprise and something close to disbelief. The floor was warm, not slightly less cold than expected, but genuinely warm to the touch. Lars spent 20 minutes in Henrik's cabin, warming himself by the fire and repeatedly touching the floor, as if confirming his senses were not deceiving him. He asked Henrik to explain the construction again, and this time he listened with the attention of someone who recognized the difference between theory and proven results. Henrik walked him through each layer, from the support posts to the compartmented sawdust to the top floor planks. Lars asked about materials cost, construction time, and whether the system required special maintenance. Henrik answered each question honestly. Yes, the system was expensive. Yes, it required weeks of labor. No, it needed no special maintenance beyond normal floor care. The sawdust was permanently sealed between the floor layers and would last as long as the cabin stood. Lars nodded slowly and said he would need to rebuild his floor before next winter. His family could not endure another season with ice forming on interior floors. After Lars left, other neighbors began arriving over the following days as word spread. Amos Rutledge came first, skeptical but curious. He entered Henrik's cabin during a period when outside temperature was 15 below zero, felt the warm floor, and stood silently for a full minute, processing what he was experiencing. His own cabin floor, he admitted, was currently unbearable. His wife had moved their children to sleep in a loft area because floor-level cold was too intense. William Thatcher visited next, bringing Tobias Kern with him. Tobias, who had mocked Henrik's sawdust construction most vocally, entered the cabin and immediately noticed the temperature. He walked to the far wall, away from the fireplace, and knelt on the floor. He remained there for several seconds, his hand pressed flat against planks that should have been frozen but were instead noticeably warm. When he stood, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked Henrik how much sawdust would be required for a cabin 18 feet by 22 feet. Henrik did the calculation aloud, explaining the 6-inch depth requirement and the need for dense packing. Approximately 200 cubic feet of material, perhaps 180 sacks at the density Henrik had achieved. Tobias nodded and said he would begin hauling sawdust from Gresham's mill as soon as the storm broke. His wife had been complaining about the floor cold for 2 winters. He had dismissed her concerns as typical female discomfort with frontier conditions. Now he understood she had been describing a genuine structural problem that had a genuine solution. Over the next week, as the extreme cold gradually moderated, 7 different neighbors visited Henrik's cabin. Some came openly seeking information. Others came with transparent excuses about borrowing tools or discussing spring trapping plans. But all of them found reasons to spend time inside, to feel the floor temperature, to compare it against their own frozen cabin floors. The mockery had ended. The questions were earnest now, practical inquiries about construction methods and material sources. Henrik shared everything freely. He drew diagrams showing the platform framework and compartment system. He explained the importance of dense sawdust packing and level construction. He provided estimates of time and cost. He did not promote his method or claim superiority. He simply answered questions and let the floor speak for itself. Silas Weatherby arrived at Henrik's cabin on a bitter morning in late January, carrying an unusual item, a mercury thermometer he had purchased from a trading post 3 years earlier. Silas was a methodical man, a former schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who had moved west seeking land and freedom from Eastern constraints. He approached problems scientifically when possible, and he wanted objective measurements of what Henrik had achieved. Henrik welcomed him inside. Silas immediately set to work. He placed the thermometer on Henrik's floor near the fireplace and waited 5 minutes for an accurate reading. The mercury settled at 68 degrees. He moved the thermometer to the cabin's center, 15 feet from the fireplace. After another 5-minute wait, the reading showed 62 degrees. At the far wall, 20 feet from heat source, the thermometer registered 58 degrees. Silas recorded these numbers in a small notebook he carried. Then he asked Henrik to extinguish the fire temporarily. Henrik complied, letting the flames die down to bare coals that produced minimal heat. They waited 30 minutes for the cabin to cool. Silas took new measurements. Near the dead fireplace, 54 degrees. At the center, 51 degrees. At the far wall, 48 degrees. The floor was retaining substantial warmth even without active heating. Silas explained that this demonstrated thermal mass effect combined with insulation. The wooden floor planks absorbed heat when the fire burned, then radiated that heat back into the cabin gradually. The sawdust layer prevented the stored heat from escaping downward into frozen ground. The system was not just blocking cold from rising, it was actively storing and releasing heat. Silas asked if he could take comparative measurements at another cabin. Henrik suggested Tobias Kern's place, close enough for the same weather conditions. They bundled up and walked the mile to Tobias's cabin together. Outside, temperature was 12 degrees above zero, cold but not extreme by recent standards. Tobias admitted them, and Silas immediately placed his thermometer on the floor near Tobias's fireplace. The fire was burning vigorously, flames consuming wood at a rate that suggested high fuel consumption. After 5 minutes, the thermometer read 42 degrees. Silas moved it to the cabin's center. 38 degrees. At the far wall, 34 degrees. The floor was barely above freezing despite a roaring fire heating the cabin air. Silas took air temperature measurements next, holding the thermometer at chest height. Near the fireplace, 70 degrees. At the center, 58 degrees. At the far wall, 46 degrees. The data told a clear story. Tobias's cabin had warm air near the ceiling and cold air near the floor, with a frozen surface that absorbed heat faster than the fire could generate it. Henrik's cabin had warm air and warm floor, with temperature distributed more evenly throughout the living space. The difference in floor temperature between the two cabins was approximately 24 degrees in areas equidistant from their respective fireplaces. Silas performed one additional measurement. He asked Tobias if he could take a reading of the ground outside. They stepped out, and Silas buried the thermometer bulb in snow down to frozen earth. After 3 minutes, he withdrew it. The mercury showed 6 degrees above zero. The frozen ground was 6 degrees. Henrik's floor, 20 feet from his fireplace, was 58 degrees. The difference was 52 degrees. Silas Weatherby's measurements spread through the scattered settlement community faster than any previous news. A 52-degree temperature difference was not subjective observation or exaggeration. It was documented fact that made Henrik's floor system impossible to dismiss as elaborate foolishness. Men who had mocked the sawdust construction now asked serious questions about replicating it. The conversation shifted from whether the system worked to how quickly they could build their own versions. Lars Bergquist was the first to begin construction. He arrived at Henrik's cabin in early February with specific questions about platform height, sawdust density, and compartment sizing. Henrik spent an afternoon explaining every detail, including mistakes he had made and corrections he would implement if building again. Lars took notes and asked about obtaining sawdust from Gresham's mill. Henrik provided directions and suggested mentioning Henrik's name, as Gresham would understand the sawdust's purpose now. Over the next week, 3 more neighbors began planning similar projects. William Thatcher decided to rebuild his floor completely, following Henrik's method. Exactly. Amos Rutledge chose a modified version, using only 4 inches of sawdust depth to save materials and construction time. Silas Weatherby designed an enhanced system incorporating additional features he thought would improve performance, including a vapor barrier made from oiled canvas. The construction work began in March as weather moderated enough for major projects. Lars completed his floor first, finishing in late April after 7 weeks of work. He invited Henrik to inspect the results. The construction was solid, the craftsmanship good. Though Lars had spaced his support posts slightly wider than Henrik recommended. Henrik suggested the floor might develop minor sagging over years, but it would perform well thermally. Tobias Kern started his rebuild in May, determined to have the work finished before next winter. He enlisted his 2 sons to help, speeding the process significantly. By June, Tobias had a complete double-floor system installed. He admitted to Henrik that he had been wrong to mock the sawdust idea, wrong to assume traditional methods were adequate simply because they were traditional. His wife, he said, was already planning how she would enjoy warm floors next winter. By autumn of 1842, 8 cabins in the region had been rebuilt using variations of Henrik's insulation system. Each builder made minor modifications based on available materials or personal preferences, but all followed the core principle of trapped air insulation between floor layers. Gresham's lumber mill, previously treating sawdust as waste, now had regular customers hauling it away for construction purposes. Gresham started charging a nominal fee, recognizing that his waste product had acquired value. The spread of the technique was organic and quiet. Nobody promoted it formally. No newspaper articles appeared. No official recognition came from territorial authorities. The innovation spread because it solved a real problem, because men could see and feel the results in Henrik's cabin, and because the construction method was within the capability of any competent builder willing to invest time and materials. Spring of 1842 brought mild weather and time for reflection on what had been accomplished over the winter. Henrik's cabin had performed flawlessly through the entire cold season, maintaining comfortable floor temperatures even during the worst storms. His wood consumption had been noticeably lower than previous winters because the floor was no longer acting as a massive heat drain. The system had proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt. Silas Weatherby, who had documented the temperature measurements in January, spent an afternoon with Henrik in April discussing the broader implications of the innovation. Silas pointed out that Henrik had solved one of the fundamental problems of frontier construction using only available materials and basic carpentry. The solution required no special tools, no rare materials, no expertise beyond what competent builders already possessed. This meant the technique could spread as far as the knowledge traveled. Silas suggested documenting the method formally, perhaps writing a description for a territorial newspaper or sending plans to a builder's journal back east. Henrik declined. He had no interest in fame or recognition. He had built the floor to solve a personal problem, and he had shared the method with neighbors because keeping useful knowledge secret seemed pointless. If the technique spread further, that was acceptable. If it remained local knowledge used by a few dozen Montana settlers, that was equally acceptable. Lars Bergquist completed his first winter with the new floor system and reported results that matched Henrik's experience. His family had stayed comfortable throughout the cold months. His wife particularly appreciated being able to walk barefoot indoors without pain. His children played on the floor rather than being confined to elevated bunks. The quality of life improvement was substantial enough that Lars considered the months of construction effort worthwhile despite the hard work involved. Other neighbors who had installed the system reported similar satisfaction. William Thatcher's cabin stayed warm with significantly less wood consumption. Amos Rutledge's modified version with 4 inches of sawdust worked adequately, though not as effectively as Henrik's 6-inch design. Tobias Kern's floor performed excellently, and Tobias had become an advocate for the method, encouraging other settlers to adopt it. By May, 13 cabins in the region had double-floor insulation systems either completed or under construction. The technique had acquired an informal name among the settlers. They called it the Dalström floor, named after Henrik. He learned about this designation when a trapper he had never met arrived asking for advice on building a Dalström floor in his own cabin 40 miles to the north. The name surprised Henrik. He had simply been trying to keep warm and prevent others from experiencing what killed Marta, but if naming the technique helped it spread, he would not object. The quiet spread of practical knowledge continued through spring and summer. No formal recognition came, no medals or certificates were awarded. The innovation existed in built examples scattered across Montana Territory, in cabin floors that kept families warm through brutal winters, in the shared knowledge passed from builder to builder. Henrik had created something that worked, and that was sufficient. Henrik Dalström died on September 12, 1873, at the age of 64. He had remained in Montana Territory for 17 years after building his revolutionary floor, continuing to trap and eventually transitioning to small-scale farming as the fur trade declined. He married again in 1851, a widow named Ingrid, who brought 2 children to their union. They had 3 children together and lived quietly on their claim until Henrik's death from pneumonia following a fall cold that settled in his lungs. His funeral was attended by 37 people, a significant gathering for a man who had lived most of his life in relative isolation. The service included neighbors who had known him for decades, some of whom had rebuilt their cabin floors based on his design back in 1842. His gravestone, a simple marker carved by a local stonemason, made no mention of his innovation or its impact. It recorded only his name, birth year, death year, and the phrase beloved husband and father. But in the mountains and valleys of Montana Territory and spreading gradually into Wyoming and Idaho territories, cabins stood that incorporated the principles Henrik had discovered through tragedy and developed through obsessive attention to thermal physics he never formally studied. By 1873, an estimated 200 structures used. Double-floor insulation systems. Some followed Henrik's exact specifications. Others modified the design based on available materials or specific needs. All shared the core principle of trapped air preventing heat loss through floors into frozen ground. The settlers who built these floors rarely knew Henrik's name. The technique had spread through demonstration and word of mouth, becoming anonymous, practical knowledge rather than attributed innovation. A trapper in Wyoming might explain to a newcomer that smart builders used sawdust between floor layers. A homesteader in Idaho might show a neighbor his double-floor construction without knowing where the idea originated. The knowledge existed independent of its source, which was perhaps the highest form of success an innovation could achieve. In 1897, 24 years after Henrik's death, a territorial surveyor named Thomas Ashford was documenting construction techniques used in early Montana settlement. He interviewed elderly residents who remembered the 1840s and heard multiple references to innovative floor designs that had appeared suddenly in the early 1840s. Through careful research, Ashford traced the technique back to Henrik Dalström and documented the story in a report filed with territorial records. Ashford's report noted that Dahlström's insulation method represented a significant advancement in frontier construction, solving a problem that had caused numerous deaths from exposure in inadequately heated cabins. The technique required no technology unavailable to frontier builders, only careful observation and willingness to invest labor in proven solutions. Ashford estimated that the method had prevented dozens of cold-related deaths over the subsequent decades. The cabins Henrik influenced continued standing well into the 20th century. Some were maintained and modernized, remaining functional homes for new generations. Others were abandoned as populations shifted but remained structurally sound, their double floors intact decades after construction. The sawdust insulation did not rot or compress significantly. The compartmented design prevented settling. Henrik's engineering, developed without formal training, proved durable beyond his lifetime.